The Letters from Andre L. Daven could be the title of this addendum or part 2 to our previous podcast titled Rudolph Valentino and That French Incident. Because since we recorded that episode, Renato located the letters from Andre Daven, translated them from the French, and we believe they are so groundbreaking and relevant to this story, we had to share them. The letters from Andre Daven confirm what we previously presented, and in his own words, Andre Daven provides more details about the story. In our previous episode, we delved into the negative ramifications for Rudolph Valentino in France, which were generated by the publication of his honeymoon travel diary published in the American fan magazine Movie Weekly in March of 1924. Some of Valentino's strong dislikes of France and the French appeared in that serialized diary, which caused the furor. How did those remarks he made even come to be in print at all? And why did Valentino not know about their publication? Mr. Daven gives us some answers.
We explained in our previous episode how the Valentinos hired Rudolph Floris to act as advance man and secretary on their honeymoon in August 1923, when they visited England, France, and Italy.
Yes, Renato, and one of Floris' jobs then was to record the events of the honeymoon and write this into a narrative to use as the promotional travel diary for fan magazine publication. Robert Floris was well known in the world of French fan magazines and press, and regularly contributed to the newspaper Commedia and the movie magazine Ciné-Magazine. During the summer of 1923, he wrote his Valentino diary narrative in the first-person format, as if Rudolph was saying it all himself. As we explained previously, Valentino confided in Floris about his unhappiness with certain elements in France, and Floris admitted this took place, saying Valentino told him this in Milan. When the travel diary was published in Movie Weekly, those derogatory comments Valentino made about his honeymoon in France, which he said in confidence to Floris, appeared in print in gory detail. As we mentioned in the previous podcast, when Valentino read the published piece, he fired the traitor Floris, but the consequential fallout in France would be substantial. Substantial not only because of the immediate and furious response by the French press, but substantial because the objectionable passages in the narrative would be reprinted again and again after Valentino's death in 1926. Incredibly, the Movie Weekly diary was republished as it was included verbatim in 1929 in a book titled My Private Diary. Robert Floris wrote the original narrative, translated it from French into English, and then sent it off to the editor at Movie Weekly magazine. He did this without previously showing it to Valentino.
The travel diary became my private diary, which is still believed to be Valentino's own words.
Yes, it is, Renato, but now we learn even more about this in Daven's letters, which I'm about to read. In our previous episode, I read an article written by Jean-Louis Croze. Croze's article was a furious response to Valentino's Movie Weekly comments, in which Croze labeled Valentino francophobic. In Croze's article, he includes a letter in defense of Valentino written by the director of the Champs-Élysées Theatre in Paris, the esteemed Jacques Bertot. Croze also refers to other communications defending Valentino, and those from Andre Daven, who Croze refers to as an employee of Valentino. The following passage got you thinking, didn't it, Renato? Could this be our first tip-off that Andre Daven weighed in on this and in writing? And I quote Croze's mention of Daven from his Valentino as Francophobe article, as published in the newspaper Commedia on May 31st, 1924. Croze writes, quote, I had refrained from taking a stand about Valentino's status as a Francophobe, and I still keep my opinion about our collaborator, Andre Daven, who sent us a cable from New York last Thursday. Daven is not Valentino, and it would have been better if the latter had personally given an explanation, which will come, perhaps." End quote.
When I read Jean-Louis Croz's mention of Daven's response, I went back to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France archives and began to search. You were pretty excited when I told you what I found.
I was. I think I did an actual double take. You found that cablegram Daven wrote to Croz defending Valentino, and you found the publication of a second and more extensive letter from Daven. What a game changer, Renato. Brilliant find. So, quick, who was Andre Daven? For listeners who don't know, before we get to those letters. He was a reporter in Paris who Natasha and Rudolph discovered, ostensibly because he looked like Valentino, while on their honeymoon in Paris. Daven was one of several French actors Rudy and Natasha sponsored by bringing them to America. At their expense, they hosted Andre Daven and cast him in a role in Valentino's movie Monsieur Beaucaire in the spring of 1924. About the same time, the Movie Weekly Travel Diary appeared on newsstands. Daven responded to Croz's trashing of Valentino as a Francophobe, and did so in those two letters, one being written as an initial cablegram, and a second which was published as an article. Daven's first letter appears on May 29, 1924, as published by the recipient of that letter, Jean-Louis Croz, and I quote Daven. "Valentino authorized me to say how ridiculous is the Ciné-Magazine article. He considered it unimportant and will soon be in Paris himself to work out details. There are people like Monsieur Jacques Hebertot in Paris who can witness Rudolph Valentino's loyalty to France. And for the 6 months that I had the honor to work with Valentino, I often had the opportunity to ascertain his true love for our country. So I have a perfect contempt for the authors of such calumnies. I will be in Paris in about 20 days and will reply further to all of this. Signed, Andre L. Daven." 1 month later, on June 20th, 1924, Commedia publishes Daven's second letter. And I'm going to read Daven's entire letter, which is titled, "What Rudolph Valentino Likes and Dislikes About France." And I quote, "On May 27th in New York, I received a clipping from a magazine depicting Valentino as a Francophobe. I showed it to him. He shrugged and replied, saying, 'I have to ignore the insults made about me. I wouldn't do to the memory of my mother, who is French, the insult of not loving her country. You are French and you know me. I have people of the caliber of Jacques Hebertot in Paris to bear as witness, if ever needed, to my feelings for France.' Now, unaware of the scope of this incident, I offered to write you, and Valentino allowed me to do so. You published my cable, which, as soon as I'll be back, I will complete. I read the unkind comments with which you surround the letter of Jacques Hebertot, who nevertheless wrote what had to be written. As for me, on behalf of Valentino, I tell you this here. He does not like Deauville, the Folies Bergère, any more. He hates tourists. He was disappointed by our theaters in the middle of August, but who could blame him? The translator of this diary given to the Movie Weekly, of which Valentino only dictated an outline, and which was in fact composed finally by Miss Gladys Hall of the Movie Weekly, who never sent the final proofs to Rudolph for approval. The traitor translator neglected or forgot to quote Valentino's passages to Miss Hall, such as these, quote, "When we, Mrs. Valentino, and he, think of Paris, we think of beauty and bravery. France has always been for me a beautiful and proud woman. The Riviera during this summer is simply admirable, and the tact of the French is as perfect as their hospitality." And how many there are of such passages from Valentino. So reread the passage he devoted to Normandy, which he visited without tourists in the company of a real Norman. Saying that Rudolph Valentino abhorred Nice and Monte Carlo in December is inaccurate. But it would be perfectly in his right to feel that way. Moreover, I was with him, and I swear to you I did not meet many French people in these two cities. But this does not, however, prevent him from visiting between two films to spend peaceful holidays in Juan-le-Pin, which he adores. See Rudolph's article on this subject. The most important thing is this. Valentino and his wife have always done all possible to help the real French in America. They themselves chose our talented compatriot Paulette Duval to act in Monsieur Beaucaire in the very important role of Madame de Pompadour. They came to order the sketches of their costumes to the French artist Georges Barbier. Those costumes were executed in Paris. They have very recently engaged, again at my suggestion, a French woman, Miss Louise Lagrange. Finally, they have done everything for the success of the projects of the writer of these lines, who holds them in the most sincere gratitude. Let me tell you a story that will undoubtedly amuse you. One of the main New York newspapers devoted on Sunday, March 30th, an entire page to Valentino and his wife, who, it seems, went to the Salon des Artistes Français to criticize a painting by Albert Guillaume representing the chic at 50 years old, slightly pot-bellied, completely bald, but still adored by women. The illustrious newspaper of drawings and photos claimed that this was the great Parisian event of the moment, when at that time Valentino was finishing Monsieur Beaucaire at the famous studios. I hold this document at your disposal, but the Americans who read it firmly believe in this nonsense. My dear crows, I won't insist further. I know Rudolph adores our country, and I have for these slanders, who are only young actors annoyed at not having been acknowledged by Valentino or publicists with the delicacy and subtlety of military generals, I have only the most perfect contempt. Please excuse me for putting forth the name of Jacques Hebertot, but he and I are the ones who know Rudy, and we are always ready to defend him, because he is clean, honest, and loyal. Signed, Andre L. Daven.
We learned so much from this, and I began a search for the director at Movie Weekly, Gladys Hall.
You sure did, Renato. I think Andre Daven's word can be considered definitive on those details, which really correct the Valentino history in a major way. And we also learned definitively that Valentino did not write or ever intend for those comments about the French to appear in print. But your discovery of those Daven letters had me thinking about the timing of what was going on with Daven then. Because while writing Affairs Valentino, I discovered the S. George Ullman 1975 memoir, in which he shared the real reason Andre Daven left New York and lost the patronage of the Valentinos. When Daven wrote that first letter, the fan was about to be hit, I guess we could say. We find several first-hand accounts of Daven's rapid and very low-key exodus from New York, exactly at that time. One account was included, as I said, in George Ullman's memoir, but most compelling is the account by Valentino himself, as told in a letter he wrote to Jacques Hebertot, which was recently discovered and shared with us, a letter being sold at auction in France. This was a remarkable discovery. On July 4th, 1924, only a few days after Andre Daven's article was published on June 20th, Rudolph Valentino writes the following about Daven to Hebertot. Now, the letter was transcribed in part within the description section of the auction catalog, and I quote, "He, Rudolph Valentino, thanks him, Hebertot, for the always loyal and generous way with which you defended me against the quite nasty slanders that Ciné-Magazine and Commedia made towards me." Then Valentino talks at length about their friend Andre Daven, whom he took under his wing in New York. "It seems that I think it is my duty, knowing the sincere affection you have for the boy, to let you know the very dishonest way that he has thanked me for all that I did for him and tried to do for him." The auction house description continues, and I quote, "Valentino gave him, Daven, numerous clothes, paid for his voyage, paid him a salary, set him up in a good hotel, got him hired by Paramount to play the role of my brother in Beaucaire. Then he advised him. He got him a job as publicity man for Paramount in Paris. He paid for his return and in advance. He learns now that Daven borrowed and tried to borrow money from many friends to whom he had introduced him. Valentino continues to write to Iberto, quote, "He, Daven, owes me nearly 35,000 francs, which I consider lost. What hurts me most is not the money, but the ingratitude and hypocrisy with which he has acted towards me." End quote.
The exchange to today's market value of the amount Daven owed Valentino would be over $17,000.
And I add that we include an image of Valentino's letter about Daven to Iberto in our book titled The Rudolph Valentino Case Files. So Daven left without the meekest goodbye to his benefactors Rudy and Natasha, quietly skipped town to head home to Paris, and stiffed the Valentinos for a great deal of money. The timing of the letters Daven wrote to the author of the Valentino is Francophobe article, for me, reveal he might have been feeling guilty or making amends. And these discoveries you made, Renato, become extremely important pieces to the correction of the Rudolph Valentino narrative in the following ways. 1. We learn Valentino did not write the travel diary or even see the preliminary proofs. 2. Flori betrayed him because there was no one else there writing any other diaries of Valentino than Flori, and a noticeably angry Daven refers to him as the traitor translator. And 3, we have a comment from Valentino himself about the furor. The letters from Andre Daven contribute to other accounts of Valentino's unhappiness over his public image and the truthfulness thereof. In Baltasar Couet's book, which you translated, Renato, titled The True Rudolph Valentino, he explains in great detail how Rudolph Valentino embarked on writing a truthful autobiography with Couet in the months before his death. He gave Couet personal letters to use and told him that upon his return from New York, that summer of 1926, he would complete the truthful telling with him. And I quote Baltasar Couet's account from The True Rudolph Valentino, and I quote, "One day he called his secretary and told her to give me the only copy he had of the story of his life, published years before in one of the most important film magazines in the United States. Miss Margaret Neff gave it to me, accompanied by other similar documents. This, while Rudolph recommended them to me as if they were precious jewels or some ancient parchments, which could not be replaced in any way. He made a huge qualification about the quality of the content of one of these documents, and made sure to emphasize to me that this was a story reputed to be his autobiography titled My Life Story." End quote. Now, Renato, I do not think Valentino began work on his autobiography with Couet out of guilt for the fictional versions of his life out there. I think he was doing it because he felt cheated. Why wouldn't he? No one wants a fake version of your life to stand as truth. It had to bother him, and by all accounts it did. But back to your search for the editor who put the finishing touches on that travel diary, pretending to be the voice of Rudolph Valentino, Ms. Gladys Hall. You found a most revealing quote by this lady, which I have to share. And I quote Ms. Gladys Hall in regards to her celebrity ghostwriting skills. She says, quote, "The public don't want their stars torn down. They want to believe in them like Santa Claus." End quote. Is not that a full admission that this was obviously a tactic in the fan magazine business?
And as Couet explained, this was how stars were marketed.
Knowing what we do now from Andre Daven's letters, I have to pose the following questions. If Valentino had not died, would Robert Flori have even been able to republish the problematic remarks Valentino told him in confidence? And if Valentino had not died, would the movie weekly fictional travel diary, which he did not write a word of according to Andre Daven, would that have ever been republished in 1929 as My Private Diary? I doubt it. Somewhere in between Flori's betrayal of Valentino's confidence and Miss Gladys Hall's efforts to turn Valentino into Santa Claus, we have the great anomaly, my private diary, as it stands today. But knowing all that we do about it, I absolutely question those Valentino biographies which heavily source that diary written by Robert Flory and Gladys Hall, such as Dark Lover. In closing, I want to make a couple of things perfectly clear. 1. The documented truth about Rudolph Valentino is our only objective. We are not making things up. But our efforts in correcting this story earned us a gang of dedicated haters whose goal it is to preserve that studio-generated My Private Diary version of Valentino's life. I find it yet another tragic element in his history, that all these years later, the fiction written by, as Daven calls him, the traitor, is still passed off as fact, written by Valentino himself.
That is very true. I want to add that Andre Daven's letters are housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France archives and can be found and fact-checked by anyone. They are not make-believe.
I hope everyone will listen to the previous episode on this, if you've not already done so, and also hit the links in the caption of this episode for much more on Andre Daven on a designated blog I set up about him. And subscribe to our new Patreon account for more on our Valentino research progress.
Yes, and I hope all our listeners will listen to the previous podcast to follow this story in more details. And, as the usual, I say, Fiat Justitia Ruat Celum. And for the good guys, arrivederci.